It's the greatest pandemonium and hurly-burly.
People pour into camp, starting to build cabins, and it looks like a sure enough boom.
Long before the depot could be built, business began. And such a business.
Everyone in town nearly sold whiskey. Oh, a perfect paradise for gamblers, cutthroats, and girls.
These were the Wild West days, the days after the Civil War when young Americans full of spirit craved adventure. They joined the Great Migration as it thundered westward, and when the dust settled, the people set to work. The wide open spaces soon rang with the sounds of change. The West was not a completely barren place. Right from the very beginning, towns and cities sprang up. Some died, others were moved and rebuilt in better locations. But there was one thing they all had in common. Wild West towns were vivid reflections of the restless men and women who built them. Heaven and hell. They were places for God and the devil. Buffalo hunters needed guns, mule skinners groceries. Cowboys came for fun, lonely prospectors for some company. Good girls looked for husbands, bad girls just for men. Doctors, lawyers, merchants, and Indian chiefs all came together to make somewhere out of nowhere.
They were at the edge of the last great frontier or jumping off place, the beginning and the end of civilization and the beginning of the badness and the lawlessness of the frontier. Robert Wright, frontier town builder.
Robert M. Wright was known as the Merchant Prince of the Great American Plains. He left his home in Bladensburg, Maryland, and headed west at the ripe old age of 16. Wright made his living as a bullwhacker, taking wagons loaded with supplies across the frontier. Hooked on adventure, he fell in love with this new land.
Out in the cold and storm for a month or two, never during that time being near a house or cheerful habitation, when cold and storm were really more terrible than an Indian attack. Yet this kind of life gives one a zest for adventure. In fact, one could not permit himself to give it up.
3 years later, Robert was driving stagecoaches along the Santa Fe Trail when he fell in love again. He married 13-year-old Alice Armstrong from Missouri. As a young woman, she had both courage and nerve. Once during an Indian attack, Alice shielded their children with a mattress and then calmly proceeded to load guns for the men. Robert had a better life in mind for Alice, a plan to build a town, a place that later became a symbol of the Wild West, Dodge City, Kansas.
In American popular culture, Dodge City is often seen as a classic Western town. One of the articles written on it called it the most Western town of all. In a way it was, although not in the way I think that most people think. It was a classic Western town because it played to people's fantasies. People came to Dodge City because they were chasing dreams, economic dreams.
Building began in western Kansas along the Arkansas River near the U.S. Army's Fort Dodge. In 1872, this was the heart of buffalo country. Robert Wright and his partners soon made a fortune as middlemen, shipping buffalo hides back east. Additional profits came from supplying buffalo hunters with the bullets needed to keep up with the demand.
The streets of Dodge were lined with wagons, bringing in hides and meat and getting supplies from early morning to late at night.
Bob Wright and Charlie Rath got in on the ground floor. They estimated that they shipped out 850,000 buffalo hides. But that was only the beginning.
Buffalo bones were shipped east by the ton for fertilizer, bone china, and buttons.
Buffalo bones were legal tender in Dodge City. There were great stacks of bones piled up by the railroad track, hundreds of tons of them. Dodge excelled in bones, like she did in buffalo hides.
But by 1874, Robert M. Wright's dream was about to fall victim to a shortage. The buffalo herds were disappearing. Hunters had killed more than 3 million near Dodge City alone. With the buffalo herds on the wane, something needed to be done. For other towns in the West, selling real estate had created a boom.
Sale! Lots, lots, lots! The situation is such as scarcely to admit a doubt of its becoming in a short time a large and important place.
The bait was swallowed whole, and town building on the frontier became a mania.
Land! Come one, come all! Rates cheaper than was ever known before!
Each town newspaper sang its siren song, and thousands listened.
The new El Dorado! Gold in Kansas territory!
But when people in the East looked to the West, they saw it as a great blank slate. It was a playground for their imagination. It was a place where they could go and make their lives better, or make their lives over, or start again. It was like a beach that was washed clean, and they could build whatever castles they wanted out of the sand there.
Thousands of Mormons fled to Utah and Idaho, seeking asylum from harassment. Mormon towns prospered, and soon great castles of faith rose skyward from the Promised Land. The West also provided a haven to tens of thousands of African Americans. Their flight from poverty and oppression was called the Exodus Movement.
Friends and fellow citizens, having been to Kansas on a tour of inspection and examined the various inducements to immigration to that place, I, Benjamin Singleton, feel it my duty to give all the information to our downtrodden race of Tennessee.
They called him Old Pap Singleton, the Black Moses. This spry, white-haired man in his 70s helped promote the Exodus. In the single year of 1879, over 20,000 black men, women, and children left the South to settle in Western towns, or build all black towns of their own, like Nicodemus, Kansas.
There is abundant room for all good citizens, and no room for loafers or bummers. We want all good people there, who are willing to live by the sweat of their own brow.
In the 19th century, I think most people thought that the West was the most American part of the country, that in a sense there was a general standard American culture. We have discovered since then that the West was full of enclaves of different people, and that it proved to be the melting pot that wouldn't melt.
Many towns had dominant nationalities. There were Swiss in Kansas, Russians in North Dakota, and Jews in Arizona. There were towns in Texas that sang in German, and places in Nebraska where Danish was preferred. In many regions, 1 out of 4 residents were foreign-born.
There were more people born outside the United States in a mining town in Idaho or Montana or Colorado than you would find in New York City or Boston at the same time.
The inspiration for creating towns often went a tad beyond the usual. In Kansas, a group of vegetarian settlers plotted the octagon-shaped town called Neosho. Unlike Neosho, you could find a steak in Greeley, Colorado, but no liquor to wash it down. And Runnymede, Kansas, was built to teach rich young Englishmen how to farm. It didn't last long because the lads preferred tennis to the plow. Old-timers said a town in the Wild West couldn't last without luck and pluck. While most places had the pluck, Dodge City definitely had the luck. The Santa Fe Railroad decided to make the town a major shipping center for cattle. Before the last buffalo was gone, Dodge City had itself a new cash cow. The Texas Longhorn had arrived, and that's when the fun really began in the Wild West. Without a steady stream of greenbacks, even the toughest Western town could wither up and die. To make money, the towns had to persuade the rough and tough men of the frontier to come in for a visit. And the best way to do that was with whiskey and women. Writer Owen White remembered his hometown.
The town's Christians, who peddled groceries, hardware, mowers, plows, coffins, and mining machinery, they knew that the thing that brought customers from afar into their stores was El Paso's invitation to step up to the sinner's bench. And they took advantage of it. They even encouraged it. Owen White, El Paso, Texas.
Many people in the early Western towns were torn between understanding the economic importance of sin and still, on the other hand, wanting a respectable town where they could have their families and raise their children. What usually happened is that they compromised by moving the sinful part of town out to the end. They called it the Tenderloin District, the Red Light District, and they also often institutionalized sin.
Nowhere was sin more institutionalized than in the towns along the great cattle trails from Texas, Wichita, Abilene, and Dodge City. Second to none, Dodge City was actually praised as the beautiful, bibulous Babylon of the frontier.
May 1877. Dodge City is boiling over with buyers and drivers. Everything you hear is about beeves and steers and cows and toddies and cocktails. Bless your soul, what a sight! Texas newspaper reporter.
The cowboys were hardy and wild, and when they reached Dodge City, they made Rome howl.
By 1877, Robert Wright owned the largest general store in Dodge City. The more cowboys who came to town, the more he'd profit. So Wright made sure his Texan cowhands felt right at home.
Getting drunk and riding up and down the sidewalks as fast as a horse could go, firing a six-shooter and whooping like a wild Indian were favorite pastimes. All could be had for a price. There were women, dance halls, music, saloons. Every gambling device known at the time was in full blast.
Well, attracting the cowboy to town was a deliberate policy. In the case of both Wichita and Dodge City, emissaries were sent into Texas to encourage the cattle trade to come to their particular town. Well, they weren't going to come to that town unless there were conditions that were good for the cattle trade. And for the cowboys, that meant having entertainment.
Saloon keeper George Hand kept a diary.
Treated all the boys, everyone drunk. No fights. Made some egg drinks for the girls at the corral. Got tight myself. Shot at a dog, missed him. Buck Ryan come in and got drunk in 15 minutes. I was obliged to get drunk myself to make him spend his money.
Alcohol was the ideal article of frontier commerce. It was easy to carry, it didn't spoil, you could take it over long distances rather easily. And when you arrived at your destination, you could take this commodity and you could inflate it by watering it down and by adding all sorts of things, from brown sugar to tobacco juice to strychnine. And then you could sell it in very small quantities for a lot of money.
And speaking of the populations, you didn't count people anyway. You counted saloons and dance halls. In our town, there were 36 saloons and 7 dance halls. Ann Ellis, frontier townswoman.
Ann Ellis didn't come west. She was brought west by her parents. Her father dreamed of finding a bonanza in the mining camps of Colorado. but he struck poverty instead. Anne's childhood fears were ghosts, Indians, and starvation. Unfortunately, going hungry became a real worry when her father abandoned the family.
So we are left, my young mother and 2 babies. I seem to remember watching and waiting for a letter.
Anne's mother, Rachel, barely managed to scrape by even after she remarried. Cooking for the miners left little time to watch her children, and that left Anne plenty of time to peek at folks around town and record some astute observations.
There were good and bad saloon keepers, and good and bad saloons. QT ran a high-class place, having no drunken men around, getting his bouncer busy as soon as a fight was started. And across the street from QT's was Uncle Sam's place, and quite different in every way. Once, when I saw in it, I wondered what drew the men to a dirty place like this.
These towns were dominated by mostly men. These men had left their families behind. They were terribly lonely, and drinking was one way to escape that. Alcohol, after all, then and now, was a great escape. And these men had more reason to call upon it than most people did.
Mid pleasures and palaces.
When the saloons opened, the soiled doves of the frontier, otherwise known as prostitutes, were not far behind. Wyoming's Madame Isabel kept a journal.
The girls were attired in short, low-cut, fancy dresses and were bare-legged. They wore all the jewelry they could. They used heavy makeup and reeked of cheap perfume. Most of them smoked cigarettes, for at that time it was the trademark of a fallen woman. Madame Isabel Donegan, Wyoming.
When our outfit came down to Miles City, there were some new girls there too, fresh from the east. They was afraid of us wild Texas cowpunchers. They didn't want to have anything to do with us at first, but they got over that. The girls said I was the best-looking cowboy on Powder River, Teddy Blue.
When we think about prostitution, we tend to think of it in terms of a moral issue. But I think that we also need to think of it as an economic enterprise. Prostitution was, after all, a business, and many women chose to go into prostitution because they could make better money being prostitutes than they could working in factories or in any other of the types of employment open to women at the time.
Isabel Donegan became a prostitute after her husband died in New Orleans. Soon she went west with a new goal.
My only aim in life now would be to open a house of ill repute. I would be in charge as madam. I went into prostitution as a way of life. Local miners only averaged $3 a day, and women clerks and waitresses about $1.50. So $1 paid for a trick was easy money.
Prostitution drew women of all races, all ethnicities, all religious backgrounds, all social classes, and women had a huge variety of reasons for going into prostitution. New England school teachers, for example, often came out to the cattle towns and worked the cowboy population, shall we say, during the summer months, made good money during that 6 months, and then went back for the winter to their New England homes.
Soiled doves often earned nicknames and a certain legendary status. Dodge City had Squirrel Tooth Alice. A madam named Chicago Joe thrilled the boys in Helena, Montana. Madame Moustache fancied gunfighters. Calamity Jane, she liked just about everybody. And in El Paso, Fat Alice Abbott always gave to the sick and the poor.
We love to think of prostitution as Miss Kitty on Gunsmoke, the whore with a heart of gold who helps everybody. And certainly there were women like that in the West. But there was also a very dark underside to prostitution as well. Many of them drank excessively, were addicts in other ways, to drugs especially. Many of them committed suicide, and it was not at all uncommon for women who were prostitutes to have to end their careers because of venereal disease.
Little Ann Ellis wore a nightgown made of canvas torn from a cabin wall. For her, the fast ladies seemed glamorous and exotic. That's what she thought until she met a prostitute named May Day.
Without faltering, May unfastened her clothes, exposing arms, shoulders, and breasts, all scarred. Teeth marks, May hissed. Men's. There stood May Day, stripped, battle-scarred. Slowly, she raised her arm, pointed to the door, and sobbed, "Go now."
Not all of a town's entertainment was found in the red light district. At theaters across the frontier, crowds were thrilled by this unusual performer. Stick around. The curtain is about to go up in the Wild West.
Why is a dog's tail like the end of the world?
I am sure I do not know, Mr. Foy. There seems to be no resemblance.
Because it's fur to the end.
Frontier townspeople didn't care if the jokes were stale. Entertainment was hard to come by in the Wild West.
But suppose the dog has no tail.
Oh, then it ain't so fur.
Eddie Foy's career began in 1865 on the streets of New York City's Lower East Side. An Irish saloon keeper saw the little shoeshine boy dancing on the sidewalk and invited the child to entertain his patrons. At age 22, Eddie Foy decided to head west.
The only hope for young aspirants lay in what were later called honky-tonks.
Foy's Western debut was at Dodge City's brand new Theatre Comique, better known as the Comicue by the Cowboys. It was the 4th of July, 1878, and the whole town was invited. Wild and woolly Dodge City finally thought it was getting cultured.
The West then and now, I think, has a kind of a cultural inferiority complex, always striving to achieve cultural respectability that they think that they don't have, although I think they do. And one of the ways they would do that would be to try to imitate or to ape what they considered high culture in the East and in Europe. And this would typically be a theater or, above all, an opera house. There might not be opera performed in the opera house, but they would call it that, and that would give them a sense of overcoming a sense of cultural inferiority.
Miners packed the opera house for entertainers such as Little Lotta Crabtree, and Shakespeare's tragedies were so popular, audiences recited the lines along with the actors. But the most sensational star of the wild frontier was Ada Isaac Menken, famous for being dressed in what was considered a state of undress. A former Mississippi riverboat captain turned newspaper reporter wrote this flattering, almost cosmic review of Menken's performance in Virginia City, Nevada. His name, Mark Twain.
A magnificent spectacle dazzled my vision. The whole constellation of the great Menken came flaming out of the heavens like a vast spray of gas jets and shed a glory abroad over the universe as it fell.
Ada Menken's extravaganza whipped the mining towns into a frenzy. Spouting poetry and wearing flesh-colored tights, she lashed herself across the back of a stallion and galloped through the theater. At the close of the show, the miners tossed gold nuggets on stage. Ada grossed an average of $2,000 a night, the highest-paid theatrical performer of her time. Theater wasn't the only entertainment. Frontier townspeople loved to dance at the masquerade ball. But being quick on your toes took on a whole new meaning when cowboys came to a dance hall. Eddie Foy described the night the fearless duo of Bat Masterson and Doc Holliday chose survival over bravado.
It had come to be one of my jobs to call the figures for the old-time square dances. All balance left, swing the right hand, lady, bang, bang, bang. That Masterson was just in the act of dealing a game of Spanish Monte with Doc Holliday, and I was impressed with the instantaneous manner in which they flattened out like pancakes on the floor.
But the biggest attraction of a frontier town, bar none, was shopping. Townspeople could buy all the things they'd left back east and long for what they couldn't afford. As far as clothes were concerned, Westerners loved to get gussied up.
I had a new white Stetson hat that I paid $10 for, and new pants that cost $12, and a good shirt and fancy boots. Lord, I was proud of those clothes. Teddy blue.
In the Wild West, clothes didn't just make the man. They made the woman a lady.
Western women were extremely fashion conscious for a couple of reasons. They liked to wear fancy clothes because it showed success, it showed wealth, but also they saw their mission as bringing the civilization they knew back east or back in Europe to the American West.
And the most civilizing part of a woman's wardrobe was the bustle. Every woman desired one, the bigger the better. Ann Ellis couldn't afford the store-bought kind, so she improvised.
I must have a bustle, and not a heavy one. So, hunted up an empty tomato can, punched a hole in the bottom, ran a string through it, and had a lovely bustle. Of course, there were a few sharp corners, but you can't have everything.
Because the old photographs are black and white, we always think of women as going around in very dowdy, grayish type clothing. It's not true at all. They wore very bright colored things. Women loved color.
Especially popular in 1871 was the Dolly Varden dress, named after the heroine of Charles Dickens' Barnaby Rudge.
On the illuminated pier, I saw my little dear down, down, yes, down on the beach at Brighton.
One of the ways you could watch a community mature was to watch how people amuse themselves.
The frontier town was full of excitement, but people paid a high price for this freewheeling anarchy. Eddie Foy said the vice in Leadville, Colorado was so naked and unashamed, it was unsafe to own anything of value.
This general lawlessness drove the citizens to taking direct and illegal action, and Judge Lynch did a great deal more to correct conditions than the courts of justice had done.
Entertainment in the Wild West had its dark side. A good necktie party was a standing room only event.
Dead, dead, dead! The vigilantes at work! 3 men hang by the neck until they are dead!
Violence was front-page news in the Wild West. Some towns gained reputations more wicked than they often deserved, but it was generally true that the first years of a town's life were the bloodiest.
These men lived a tough life out on the prairies, and when they came to town, they let off steam, and at that point there were many killings.
We were entirely without law and order. Differences were settled with rifle or six-shooter on the spot. Robert Wright.
The frontier was lawless by its very nature, since small, isolated towns were on their own. For the few women who came into these places, the violence was terrifying. Calvina Anthony, the wife of one of Robert Wright's partners, wrote passages in her diary that read more like battle reports.
Dodge City, 1872. The revolver being a very strong factor in all departments of social life, differences and disputes often ended in violence, as Boot Hill could testify if it could speak. Every few days we used to hear of some poor soul gone to his account from sudden death.
As Dodge City grew, the town fathers experienced a shattering insight. Violent deaths were not conducive to business. Robert Wright described how they took the boom out of the boomtown.
When a certain party or parties got too obnoxious to the decent part of the community, they would be notified to leave town. And if they did not go, the vigilantes or the respectable citizens would raise up in their might and shoot them to death.
Before long, the vigilantes went out of control, and then you couldn't tell the good guys from the bad. So towns suddenly saw the value of a court system with elected lawmen.
October 13, 1877. At the earnest request of many citizens of Fort County, I have consented to run for the office of sheriff. I have no pledges to make, as pledges are usually considered before election to be mere claptrap. Respectfully, W.B. Masterson.
William Barclay Bat Masterson won by 3 votes. Bat had a reputation as a dapper and self-assured shootist. He came to Dodge City following the buffalo and stayed on, working sometimes as a bartender, much of the time as a gambler.
He had tremendous power just in his personal appearance, apparently. He could force tough men to do things without getting into the involvement of killing.
You can't be soft-shelled with these men. You can't let them bulge on you. If you're a tenth of a second late in judging a man's intentions, you're on your way to Boot Hill.
It was a violence that was shepherded. That is, it was controlled, it was corralled, to use a good Western term. And you were tolerated a certain amount of macho activity. You were not tolerated to go around killing people.
Get 6 young cowboys to carry my coffin, 6 pretty whore gals to sing me a song.
In his travels throughout the West, entertainer Eddie Foy was often a reluctant witness to frontier justice.
There was no ceremony, no last words, no delay. Nooses had been made in pieces of heavy new rope, and men seized them and hauled away. The doomed victims were drawn, struggling and kicking off the floor. I would have given anything to get away, but I was wedged so tightly in the crowd that I could not escape. I could only shut my eyes and refuse to see any more.
Taming a town with law and order was one thing. Cleaning up the place was another. Boom towns were uncomfortable, unsightly, unseemly, disease-ridden, vermin-filled communities.
There was no thought of sanitation on a public level, and consequently, trash built up. There were cesspools of trash. It is said that the Dodge City hangers-on at the saloon watched one day as they knew a man would step off into a hole that would sink up to his waist, and no one said a word because they thought that would be fun to watch him.
The early pictures of Western towns conveyed a sense of something just growing bit by bit without any overall planning. And then along would come a fire and wipe out practically the whole town, and they'd start over again with a plan or with some idea of organization. And almost all Western towns, I used to think, really needed a good fire.
If a town was rebuilt, it usually meant there was a good economic reason for its being there in the first place. This monetary concept of permanency often inspired people to clean up their act with some real town planning.
Hear the mellow wedding bells, golden bells. What a world of happiness their harmony foretells.
Put on your Sunday best. There's a wedding in town in the Wild West.
The wedding feast was royal, the bride indescribably sweet, the bridegroom triumphant, and the whole company, including the minister, very happy. Wichita Eagle, August 6, 1876.
The marriage business prospered in the Wild West. Despite their rough image, frontier townspeople treasured the Victorian customs they'd left behind back east, and marriage also had a positive effect on the town as a whole.
Marriage indicated permanence, stability. It also opened the way for things like children, schools, churches.
The lifestyle under the Victorians was centered in the family. That is the ideal. It may not have always worked that way, but the ideal was that it would be in the family. And they saw the family as a continuum and as an example of the permanency that would be not only the towns, but themselves.
Townspeople quickly embraced a relatively new invention that promoted family togetherness: photography.
One big day, we have our pictures took. I am standing, enjoying it all. I always like to show off, had my hair pulled over my shoulder so it would show. I put my hand on Mama's shoulder, the other on Henry's. A family group is the result. Ann Ellis.
No symbol of permanency surpassed the birth of a child. Town boosters could claim a new citizen, even though the newspapers only congratulated the fathers.
Henry Sturm is a proud father of a girl. We wish Mr. Sturm many happy returns, and may he live long and prosper. Dodge City Times, July 17, 1880.
In the towns, women probably used doctors to deliver babies more than rural women, just because doctors were more available in the towns. But pregnancy was a problem, whether it was rural or town-based, because there was such a high mortality rate of both mothers and children.
Entertainer Eddie Foy knew the tragedy well. He lost his wife Rose in childbirth.
The ordeal, when it came, was too great for her strength, and she died in my arms. The little child for which she gave her life was taken also. My life seemed to stop short for a while and almost lose its reason for continuance.
In a frontier town, children symbolized the future, which was what town building was all about. But while they waited to inherit that future, kids like Ann Ellis and her little brother Ed pulled their own weight to help the family get by.
Mama washed all the time, and Ed and I delivered the clothes, a big bundle each week to the Rathvons. This was a mile walk, but we liked to go, as Mrs. Rathvon often asked us in, treated us. And besides, we could see carpets, curtains, and pictures, and glimpses of other wonderful things.
We're just beginning to understand the crucial role of women in the settlement of the West. It was the women who usually founded the first schools, who supported the first churches, who were superintendents of education rather early, which in turn led people to give them the vote, however reluctantly, because they were already in public life.
There were no schools, there not being enough children to start one. But we got all we could together, about 10, and formed them into a Sunday school class. Calvina Anthony, Dodge City.
When it came to ridding the town of its wild and wicked ways, the women led the charge. Pressuring the prostitutes, giving gamblers the gate, and smashing the saloons.
They see themselves as social housekeepers. They come to a town or they come to an area, and they see it as their function to bring morality, to bring, quote, civilization, to bring all the rules of an established society with them.
Just who would support which reform was the big question. When it gave him a political advantage, Dodge City lawman and former bartender Bat Masterson supported prohibition. But city father Robert Wright begged the legislature to rescue Dodge from the curse of temperance.
If you do this, harmony will again prevail upon the border. The scouts will be called in, and future generations of cowboys will arise and call you blessed.
But the legislature didn't listen to Robert Wright, and prohibition came to Kansas in 1885. Saloons became soda fountains, towns, and gambling joints and brothels moved away. The clientele shifted from rowdy cowboys to farmers. Dodge City lived on, but the sun had finally set on the beautiful, bibulous Babylon of the frontier. Robert Wright's fortunes declined as the old Dodge City died, but his love for the place never wavered. Wright donated land for its largest park that continues to bear his name today. Anne Ellis only had a year of school, but grew up to become the author of 3 critically acclaimed books about her life. She also received an honorary doctorate from the University of Colorado. Back east, the 7 Little Foys became a vaudeville sensation, all due to the return engagement and the remarriage of their dad, Eddie. Dodge City Sheriff Bat Masterson hung up his guns and picked up a pen. Bat became a sports writer and promoter in New York City. And even Madame Isabel went the way of the respectable West. She adopted a child and remarried.
Change, everywhere change. Did I say everywhere? I don't quite mean that. There's one place where Dodge City has not changed. Her spirit seems the very manifestation of the Western spirit of our dreams.